I think the most important thing is never to let the joke get in the way of the functional conversion copy.
This is That Marketing Podcast.
Made by marketers for marketers.
Welcome to another edition of That Marketing Podcast, brought to you by Spotlight UK. Today we're dipping our toes into the tricky topic of brands being funny with Adam Hunt, the founder of White Label Comedy. I ask Adam about the journey that brands take into introducing comedy into particularly their social feeds, but other elements of their content as well. And I pit his comedy chops against my favourite show, Blackadder. I hope you enjoy.
Well, Adam, first off, thank you very much for coming on the podcast to chat us about humour with us.
Absolute pleasure to be here, mate. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to start with the basics. I think humour is one of the things, like, we all think that we're funny, especially in a personal sense. But when you try and write jokes, as I sort of started doing for some of our social things, it becomes quite hard to sort of pre-write a joke for that B2B world. So can you sort of talk us through what a joke is? What are the basic assumptions you need to have in place before you can actually write something that comes across funnily, if that's a word?
It is now. Yeah. Well, look, I think a couple of really important basic understandings, and these are understandings that we've, have evolved in our own work and how we operate. But two key things. One is that when talking about social content, to begin with, when someone engages with a piece of your content, they're not doing it to tell you they liked it. They're doing it to kind of serve their own social purposes. And so a huge part of what we do is really quite geeky and quite research driven, getting a handle on what those social purposes are so that we can reflect your basics, so that we can give them content that they want to share. That's actually kind of more important than the joke itself, is just making sure that it represents something that your audience is keen to share. And then when it comes to actually writing a joke, like, basically all a joke is, and my writers hate me for being so reductionist, but that's why it's great being more of a producer than a comedy writer, is I can be reductionist about everything they do that you might see as magic. Is a joke is just two things that shouldn't fit together, but you've made them fit together with a clever twist in the middle. Our brains kind of have a little gap to jump, but it's enough of a gap that it's funny when we sort of piece the riddle together. That sparks a little bit of joy. If you look at any joke that made you laugh, all it really is, whatever the joke, is two things that shouldn't fit together, but you've made them fit together with a little twist. And when you understand that, you can start to go, all right, what are the things that my audience wants to hear? What can I say to them that they will agree with? And then you find ways to say the things they'll agree with in that kind of joke format. So you're giving their brains a little riddle to unpack, and they're enjoying it. So I don't know if that makes it sound more complicated or less complicated, but that is everything we do.
Right. Okay. I mean, most of the guys probably listening to this are going to be probably business with sort of established brands. They probably already have a social channel, and most of them, like, ours included, are not going to pretend we're this is quite sort of on brand, on message, and a little bit staid and sort of boring. Is there a point where you have to sort of ramp up comedy in it, or can you sort of hit someone with a joke straight away and your audience will get it, or is it sort of you have to build the expectation that you're becoming a funny brand?
I think the key thing is that you should never make a joke for the sake of making a joke. You should always make a joke about something that matters to your audience and that is relevant to your brand. And so long as that's what you're doing, the jokes don't tend to come out of nowhere. They tend to just be more entertaining, engaging ways to represent the things you're already talking about. So I think definitely no brand should just wheel out Ricky Gervais or Michael McIntyre on the socials and expect their audience not to go, what? But so long as you are making the right jokes about the right things, it's not as jarring as you think, and it's also not as risky as you think. I think that's the key thing. It's where brands come unstuck is poor choices over topics, angles, and they forget that humor for a brand is still a piece of marketing, and it still needs to fulfill all of those other criteria to contribute to the bigger picture before you've written the joke.
Right. Okay. My first thought with this was there are probably some industries where humor shouldn't work at all. Like, if you're hiring, say, a divorce lawyer, you probably don't want to see a joke on their website the first time you log into that. But I suppose if you're making jokes the sort of your audience, then that isn't necessarily true, is it?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think it's not the case that you couldn't sell divorce lawyer services with humor. You just need to sell them in the right way. And I think what humor does, what jokes do, is they show an audience that this brand or this business or even this comedian get it. They understand me. They understand my world. So actually, probably I think for a divorce lawyer, there's going to be more persuasive copy when you load up their website. So on their website, I want to see, I just want to see that you're a reputable lawyer who probably has won 99% of his divorce cases, and you're going to keep all my money for me. That's more important, but there's still room within that to be human, to be lighthearted, to be engaging. And so long as, like I say, so long as the jokes are about things that you would already be talking about anyway, it's not a million miles away. It is literally, if a topic wouldn't appear on your sales page, then you don't need to make a joke about it anywhere, if that makes sense. But if it does, then the right kind of joke can really sort of force us to focus on the problem that you solve, and that can have, that can be game changing for conversion rates on the page. If you get it right. If you get it wrong, get it wrong, and it's you're playing with fire. But get it right, and it's a really nice addition to the impact of a message.
Okay, when you're as you do with white label company, when you're working with brands, how do you kind of deal with the I'll start that again. When you're trying to get a brand or your team within your brand to think about no, this is not going well. How do you kind of deal with the fact that a lot of brands, like the people running the pages or producing content, they aren't their target audience? I mean, for me being a B2B marketer and selling to B2B marketers, I think I'm in quite a privileged position whereby the people I'm selling to are like me, but I think that's not the case for a lot of industries. So is there a thing where it's safe to put out a joke that you don't think it's particularly funny because your audience will get it?
I think actually, brands having people running their socials, running their marketing that aren't the target audience is a much bigger problem. And that is a huge problem at every level of marketing, and not just restricted to humor and using it right. And I think actually, the brands and the agencies that get around that, they are very data driven, they're very research led, and likewise our process is very research led. So we put together a serious piece of work before we work with any new client that finds those relatable truths, those things basically that the audience will respond to with, oh, that's so true. Like we are laser focused on gathering those and using those to write jokes. I think so long as you are always starting with the audience and what matters to them, you will post, you will generate content that speaks to them and has an impact. And absolutely, it doesn't matter whether or not you like it, whether you find it funny. It's whether or not they find it funny. And like as an interesting example of that, actually, one of our recent clients, they were a data analytics company, and we very deliberately we agreed, right, we're going to do a load of basically chart and graph gags for this particular company, and we're like, right, we're going to do two kinds of joke. We're going to do some that are just broad appeal, so essentially anyone, even though they are representing the brand because it's an analytics company, and so the joke is a chart and a graph gag, still the topic's going to be very broad, life under COVID, stuff we're going through right now, the time of the year. It was all very much like broad appeal stuff. Then the other half, we were going to lean really, really hard into the pain points, the details of the service offering, the specifics of what they do for their clients. And our theory was that the broad appeal content would get a better reaction, but deliver less leads or lower quality leads for the business. The key topic content, as we called it, would maybe get a smaller reaction on social, but deliver a bigger percentage of good leads for them. And that actually is true. But what's really interesting is when we sat down and we looked at the content we developed for them at the end, just before setting it off, I was like, oh, do you know what? Like, I love the broad appeal content. The key topic content, it's not that funny. I was like, oh, have we screwed up here? Is this not good enough? But they had exactly the opposite feeling. So for them, yeah, they love the broad appeal stuff. But for them, the key topic content, they thought it was hilarious because it spoke to their truths. And that was a really interesting moment for us, because we realized that we'd done such a good job of nailing the truths and using the skill of a comedy writer to write around those truths, that we'd bypassed that bit of the process that is, oh, we're not the audience, so we can't write. And so I think, that's speak to their truth, and you'll get the reaction you need. Is the moral of that very long-winded story.
Yeah, and we talked about this when we were sort of planning this episode, that we've just finished, or I'm in the middle of watching the latest series of RuPaul's Drag Race, and they had a roast episode on there, and we were my wife and I were sitting watching it afterwards, thinking like one of the queens just came across incredibly mean, and when the others didn't, and it was quite hard for us to sort of pinpoint what the difference was. And I think I might have got it from one of the examples on your website. I found this one, I make more noise getting out of bed these days than I ever did in it. I think that's hilarious. I'm probably hopefully not the target audience for that quite, because I'm only 30, but I liked it, and I sat there and I thought, if you replace the I's with U's, that suddenly becomes really mean. Like, is it that simple that you speak as the people that you're writing to, or trying to get the attention of?
Yeah. So that's a really great example. It's one that I wheel out in quite often, because that was a joke written for a sort of independent living community client of ours, and it's really noteworthy. One, because it got a huge response, and luckily that brand was also publishing their content they'd written in-house, like alongside ours, so I could literally compare how their own post did that day and how ours did that day, and it's a huge difference that I won't show off about the numbers, but it was good. But for me, it's not a funny joke. I actually think it's not even our best work, but it is so of the audience. And just linguistic ticks, like making sure that you are talking about us rather than talking about you, are important. But it goes beyond that. So that wouldn't help you out if the joke itself was still mean and at the expense of old people. It really needs to be a joke that the audience would make about themselves, if it is self-deprecating, not just aggression wrapped up as self-deprecating humor. That's I think that's the fine line, and you can only do that if you really get to know the audience.
Sure. Okay. I think I pulled it, and I nicked this example from the little promo video you've got on your website, actually. So I know I've seen the numbers you're talking about on that one. I think it was the same one we talked about the existing content being on brand, on message, and really boring. Like, does comedy that kind of contrasts with the expected brand voice have a place, or does it have to? Is it kind of better that you're not in the brand voice, that you kind of you shake people up and go, oh, I wasn't expecting them to say that? Does that add to it, or does that depend really on the kind of joke that you're telling?
Here's one thing that I think is really important. I'm yet to work with a single client whose PDF brand tone of voice guidelines that they developed a couple of years back and haven't really looked at since actually ties in with anything they're doing on social anyway, because there's those, the sort of the established brand tone of voice is so rarely stuck with in a social space, because it very rarely works in a social space. So definitely, I think it's still important for us to fall in line with what the brand's actual social tone of voice is. But I think once you help a brand understand that what they're doing is really already quite far away from what they say they're doing, they're much more open to sort of take that journey with you. Also, though, because it is so research led, that every joke we would suggest a brand makes is still bang on the money in terms of their messaging. That's the key thing. Is tone of voice is one thing, but messaging is another. And I think it's the right kind of jokes for a brand aren't a million miles away from a tone they would be comfortable with. Different brands have different levels of tolerance, but because we're not suggesting that you start, sassing everyone in town and being really, aggressively funny, it's not as risky as you might think, and it's just the entertaining, engaging way to say what you were already trying to say. It's that blog post that no one read, but we've made them read it. That's all it is.
Right. Yeah, I was going to come on to sort of blogs and other because I sort of discovered you through Brands Against Mundanity, the card game that helps you to get started on these. So the outsourcing of what you do, I suppose, might be the. But then, do you think does comedy belong ever? Is there a point in the sort of heaviness of content where comedy loses? Is there a point where you get like, right now I actually want the dry details and I want this to be serious because we're talking a serious business proposition, or does that line not really exist or not exist at all?
I think the most important thing is never to let the joke get in the way of the functional conversion copy. So stepping away from social posts for a second, if you're looking at meatier pieces of copy like emails and sales pages and even Facebook ads, they are working on a very, very complex functional psychological level. And if you've already got a winning ad and I throw out all of the bits that work and replace them with jokes, your sales are gonna tank. So what we need to do is look at what's already working, go, okay, that message is working. How can I use humor to make people focus on that more, make it more effective, make it more impactful, but also acknowledging that it isn't always the most persuasive answer. So often it is, and I think definitely it helps accentuate a successful message. But there are some things that are, there are different levers you can use to sell, and sometimes you lean on others. So I think it's while there isn't any scenarios in which I would say you don't use comedy, I think we still approach everything as sort of generalist marketers that just prefer to be funny when we can and when it is effective. But you still have to have an open mind, and the challenge is always to beat the control, not to simply try and tear out the rule book and insist that comedy is the best thing ever, because you've got a pre-existing audience who you need to move the way you're selling to them on a corner turn, not just rip up, start again, and hope for the best.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, like your audience came to you for something. You're obviously doing something right to start with. I mean, especially if you're a startup, then you've not got that to lean on. But on the basis that we're probably talking more to established existing brands, then you're onto something. Yeah, that makes sense. That's quite similar to a discussion we had about rebranding in a previous episode. That your audience came to you for a reason, so you shouldn't throw them away for the sake of chasing after somebody new.
Yeah,
I'll tell you what.
Even a startup, you very rarely get to the point of marketing your startup without some proven success and without some understanding of what your audience likes about you. So even then, it's for us, if a startup is very personality led, then we're going to be building on the personality of the founder, and that founder will have ways in which they have connected with their audience and the things their audience like about them. So there's always something to start with, and there's always a control to beat, basically.
Sure. Would you approach it differently if you're writing content for employees of a brand, of a brand specifically to share, rather than the brand pages?
I think what we would do in each of those cases we would ask, what is the audience for this content? So, if you're writing for LinkedIn and it is much more personality led, we're writing for your personal audience, then that is a different audience to the brand's audience. And so just understanding the audience, our starting point is always, who is receiving this? What do we need them to do? How can we make this content that will make them do what we want them to do? So yeah, we'd approach it differently, but it's still the same question, if that makes sense. It's still it's just understanding who is in each pot of people and what are the things that unite them, and how can we give them, like, my sort of favorite stolen phrase is share and declare. Really, the best content on social is content that you give someone else that they can share, and it tells the world something about themselves. So what do we need to give your audience in order to have them share it? How can we wrap up your brand values within it so that it's not just a waste of effort on your part, and it actually does something for your brand awareness and your bigger picture? And then it may be that the personal audience and the brand audience are very similar. It may be they are similar enough that you can just use the same content in both spaces. You just need to ask that question, because it all starts with who.
Sure. Okay. When we started recording, when we were planning this episode, you said to me it's all right to challenge you. So I'm going to put you on the spot in this one. And
Please do.
So because it's all about my one, and anyone who knows me knows I'm a massive Blackadder fan. And there is a wonderful bit in season 4 where General Melchett and George enter the room, and George is saying, and the bishop said, "I'm terribly sorry, I didn't realise you meant organist." Melchett laughs, and I've turned that over my head so many times. So as a professional, someone who knows about this, I'm intrigued to see what you reckon the lead in or the setup to that joke would have been.
Well, I think, it's funny. I had a little bit of time to think about this, and I think a couple of important things. One, I think that it's a meta joke, so it's a joke about jokes, and I think it's funny precisely because we'll never know what the setup was. I also actually think that it wouldn't have been a one-liner. It wouldn't have been a zingy sort of Tim By and Gary Laney style bit. It would have been a long, rambling shaggy dog story, essentially about someone asking to see the organ, someone asking to see the organist, and the bishop showing him his knob. That is what that joke is. and when you understand that's all it could be, it's way less funny, because actually in this context, the unknown is what's funny. And so it's a weird meta joke. I think. But yeah, if you force me to unpack it, it's a joke about knobs. But I think you knew that anyway. I think it's I think that's pretty plain to see.
That is probably the first route that would have gone down. Yeah, it's good to know it's not just me being absolutely filthy on watching that.
No,
but
definitely not.
It probably, in context of the show, probably quite likely anyway. For anyone who's watching, if you haven't, you must go and watch it, because I think it's absolutely fabulous.
I think the real truth of that joke, what that joke really is it's a joke, because obviously they walk into the room having finished the joke, having just told only the punchline, and what that is it's leaning on a relatable truth about in groups and out groups, about how it feels to be included, how it feels to be excluded, and actually that relatable truth itself is the source of humor as well. And I think it's there's a lot more going on there. I think it's an interesting one, definitely to pick apart.
Cool. Okay, I think on that thoughtful nugget, I think we'll leave it there. So once again, thank you very much for coming on. Hopefully we've inspired some people to think about how they can use comedy in their content. Where's the best place for people to find you if they want to continue talking about this with you?
At whitelabelcomedy.com. Absolutely, that's the best place to find us.
Great. Okay, thank you very much, and bye for now.
Thanks a lot. Cheers, Richard.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of That Marketing Podcast. You clearly have wonderful taste. We hope you found the content useful and enjoyed it. We'd love you to subscribe wherever it is you're listening to us. Maybe leave us a review. If you can think of a topic that you'd like us to cover, or even if you fancy coming on the podcast and sharing your own experience on a particular topic, you can reach us at marketingteam@spotler.co.uk. Thanks once again, and happy marketing.